Ethan Carter had spent years fighting legal battles in the Supreme Court, but nothing could have prepared him for the absurd war brewing in his own front yard. His home, his sanctuary, was a classic, single-story craftsman with a wraparound porch and a backyard that stretched into the horizon. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, it was meant to be a peaceful retreat after decades of handling the country's most complex cases. But peace was a luxury he wouldn't be afforded. Not with Karen Andrews, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, on a relentless mission to make his life miserable. It all started with a garden fence. Ethan had always loved gardening, rare escape from the courtroom and the chaos of legal warfare. His backyard was a masterpiece of order and nature, a vegetable garden neatly arranged in raised beds, a row of rose bushes lining the pathway, and a sturdy wooden fence keeping everything in place. The fence had been there for years, installed long before he even moved into the neighborhood. It was well within property lines, perfectly maintained, and, most importantly, it was his. But according to Karen, it was a violation. The first warning letter arrived in a crisp white envelope, stamped with the HOA's official seal. It stated that his fence was non-compliant with community aesthetic standards and demanded its immediate removal. Ethan frowned at the vague language. It was lawyer speak for, "We don't like it, and we're making up reasons." He sighed and tossed the letter aside. Surely, this was just a misunderstanding. That illusion was shattered the next afternoon. Ethan had just finished watering his tomatoes when he spotted her, Karen Andrews, standing at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed in an expression of pure, HOA-induced entitlement. Her signature clipboard was tucked under her arm, a weapon of bureaucracy she wielded with pride. "You got our notice, I assume?" she asked, tilting her head. Ethan set down his watering can. "I did, and I have no idea why my fence is suddenly an issue." Karen's smile was tight. "Well, the board has decided it doesn't match the community's vision. The neighborhood guidelines clearly state that all fences must be white vinyl. Yours is," she paused, looking at the perfectly stained wooden fence. "Rustic, which isn't in line with our aesthetic." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I read the HOA regulations when I bought this house. There's nothing about wood fences being prohibited." Karen's expression twitched, but she recovered quickly. "We updated the guidelines last month." "Without notifying homeowners?" Ethan asked coolly. She shrugged. "It was in the meeting minutes." "Ah, yes. The infamous HOA meetings, where decisions were made in hushed voices and conveniently forgotten when homeowners asked questions." Ethan had never attended one, and now he regretted that oversight. "Well," he said, crossing his arms, "I won't be taking it down. It's within my property line and structurally sound. It stays." Karen's nostrils flared. "Failure to comply will result in a fine. We take these things very seriously, Mr. Carter." Ethan smirked. "So do I." She scoffed, pivoting on her heel. "You'll regret this," she muttered, striding down the sidewalk. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching her go. "Oh, I doubt that." As he walked back inside, he already knew what was coming next. Karen wasn't the type to back down. She thrived on control, on bending people to her will. And she had just met the one man who would fight her at every turn. This was only the beginning. HOA's first power move. The next morning, Ethan Carter opened his mailbox inside. Another HOA letter, this one printed in bold, urgent red ink. Violation notice number 002. Failure to comply with community fence regulations will result in a fine of $500, with an additional $50 per day until the violation is corrected. Noncompliance may result in legal action. He shook his head, amused at how quickly Karen escalated the situation. Less than 24 hours, and she had already slapped him with a fine. Predictable. Ethan walked back inside, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat down at his desk, skimming through the HOA bylaws. He had been right. The rules hadn't explicitly banned wooden fences until the latest amendments, which, conveniently, had never been properly distributed to homeowners. He smirked. Karen had just made her first mistake. Later that day, he heard the familiar sound of heels clicking against his front porch. Right on schedule. He opened the door to find Karen standing there, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched atop her head like a corporate executive conducting an inspection. Behind her stood two other HOA board members. Stanley, a frail man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, and Linda, Karen's loyal echo chamber. "Mr. Carter," Karen said, her voice saccharine sweet, "we need to discuss your ongoing violations." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "Ongoing?" Karen, it's been 1 day. That's 1 day too long, she snapped, handing him a document. This is your official second warning. I suggest you take it seriously. Ethan skimmed the paper. And what happens if I don't? Karen's eyes glinted with satisfaction. Then the HOA will be forced to take further action. Like what? You'll call the fence police. Linda gasped. We'll have you know, sir, that these rules exist to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood. Ethan chuckled. The integrity of the neighborhood? Karen, I live next to a guy who leaves his Christmas lights up year-round. And you're worried about my fence? Karen's expression darkened. Rules are rules. Ethan folded his arms. And laws are laws. Funny thing about those, you have to legally inform homeowners before changing regulations that affect their property. You didn't notify anyone before implementing these new restrictions. Which means, he tilted his head, your fine has no legal standing. Karen's face twitched. She opened her mouth but quickly shut it, clearly recalibrating her next move. Stanley cleared his throat. Karen, I told you we should have mailed out proper notices before enforcing. Karen shot him a glare so sharp he physically recoiled. The board has the authority to make decisions in the best interest of the community. Right, Ethan said, but the board doesn't have the authority to retroactively enforce a rule. Unless, of course, you'd like me to bring this up with a judge. Karen's jaw clenched. You think you're untouchable just because you're a lawyer? Ethan smirked. No, I think I'm untouchable because I know how to read. Linda gasped again. Karen's face was turning an alarming shade of red. You'll regret this, Carter. We always get compliance. I'm sure you do, Ethan replied. But unfortunately for you, I don't intimidate easily. Karen turned on her heel, marching off the porch, but not before delivering her final warning. If you don't fix this immediately, don't be surprised when you start receiving more official consequences. Ethan raised his coffee mug in mock salute. Looking forward to it. The war had begun. The HOA escalates the conflict. It didn't take long for Karen to make her next move. The following morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of a loud knock on his front door. He opened it to find a uniformed man holding a clipboard. Behind him stood a city inspector, a sour-looking man in a beige vest. Mr. Carter? The uniformed man asked. That's me, Ethan said, eyeing them warily. I'm with the City Code Enforcement Office. We received a complaint about an unpermitted structure on your property. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Unpermitted structure? You mean my fence? The inspector glanced at his clipboard. It says here that you've made unauthorized modifications to your property, specifically the installation of a non-compliant fence without proper documentation. Ethan let out a slow exhale. Karen, let me guess, he said. The complaint came from the HOA? The officer hesitated. We can't disclose the identity of the complainant. Ethan smirked. You just did. The inspector cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Regardless, we have to verify that everything is up to code. Ethan stepped aside, gesturing toward the fence. Be my guest. The inspector walked around the property, taking notes and photos. After a few minutes, he returned, shaking his head. There's nothing wrong here, he admitted. Your fence is within property lines, doesn't obstruct visibility, and meets city regulations. Ethan crossed his arms. So what now? The officer sighed. Now we close the case. But you should know, Mr. Carter, if the HOA keeps filing complaints, we're obligated to investigate. Ethan smiled wryly. Noted. As the city officials left, he spotted Karen standing on the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold with her arms crossed. She looked furious. Ethan leaned against his porch railing and called out, Nice try, Karen. You almost had me there. Her face darkened. Don't get too comfortable, Carter. This isn't over. She stormed off, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. Later that night, Ethan started digging. Something about Karen's aggression didn't sit right with him. Most HOA presidents enjoyed their little power trips, but this level of personal vendetta was unusual. He suspected that there was something bigger at play. Sitting in his study, he logged into the county records database and began searching for the HOA's financial filings. His eyebrows furrowed as he scanned the reports. There were inconsistencies. Karen's HOA had been collecting fines at an alarming rate, far more than a typical association would generate. Yet, the funds allocated for community improvements were suspiciously low. Ethan rubbed his chin. Interesting. He started calling a few neighbors, asking if they had ever been fined by the HOA. Oh, absolutely, one homeowner, Mrs. Dawson, said. They fined me $500 last year for having a flower pot that was too large. That doesn't seem right, Ethan replied. It wasn't, she admitted. But when I went to dispute it, they offered me a settlement. Pay half the fine, and they'd drop the issue. Ethan's eyes narrowed. A settlement? Yeah, they said they were being generous. I didn't want the hassle, so I just paid it. That was it. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was running a racket. She and her board were illegally collecting fines and offering shady settlements to homeowners who didn't want to deal with a legal battle. And now that Ethan wasn't complying, she was doubling down, trying to force him into submission. Big mistake. Ethan printed out the financial records, compiling them into a neat folder. If Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one. And this time, she wasn't just facing an annoyed homeowner. She was facing a Supreme Court judge who knew exactly how to dismantle a corrupt system. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Ethan Carter had anticipated Karen's next move, but even he was surprised by how far she was willing to go. 2 days after the failed city inspection, he returned home from work to find his driveway partially dug up. He blinked. What the hell? A construction crew was hard at work, jackhammering a trench right in the middle of his property. One of the workers spotted him and waved casually. You Carter? Ethan clenched his jaw. Yeah. What's going on here? The man wiped sweat off his brow. HOA ordered us to remove this section of the driveway. Said it was encroaching on community land. Ethan laughed, a short, incredulous sound. It's my property, he said. Who gave you permission? Karen Andrews, the man replied. She signed the work order. Ethan felt his blood boil. He turned on his heel and marched straight to Karen's house. She opened the door with an all-too-satisfied smirk. Ah, Ethan. I was just about to. What the hell do you think you're doing? He cut her off. Karen feigned innocence. Oh dear, did the contractors arrive already? I thought you'd appreciate the HOA assisting with necessary property corrections. Ethan stepped forward, his towering presence making her flinch slightly. You sent a crew to destroy my driveway without my consent. His voice was dangerously low. That's destruction of private property. You just committed a crime, Karen. Her smirk faltered, but she squared her shoulders. I'm simply enforcing HOA policy. Ethan took out his phone and snapped a picture of her standing on her porch. Congratulations, you just gave me everything I need. Her eyes darted to the camera. What are you talking about? Ethan held up a folder, the one containing the HOA's shady financial records. You think you can fine people into submission? That you can take their money, threaten their homes, and get away with it? His voice was steady, his legal training keeping his fury controlled. You've been running a scam, Karen. And I have the evidence. Karen's smug expression finally cracked. You have nothing. Ethan smiled. I have enough to get the city involved. He turned and walked away, ignoring her shouting as she slammed the door behind him. Now it was time for the real fight. The public exposure begins. That evening, Ethan took action. He filed a police report for property damage. He emailed the city council a detailed complaint, attaching the financial discrepancies. And most importantly, he reached out to the entire neighborhood. At 7 p.m., he stood in his driveway, speaking to a crowd of angry homeowners. I know I'm not the only one Karen has targeted, he said, holding up the fake violations. She's been abusing her power for years. But here's the good news, we can fight back. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. People began stepping forward with their own horror stories. Fines for mailbox colors, threats of foreclosure, mysterious settlement offers. Then Ethan pulled out the HOA's financial records. She's been pocketing money. HOA funds have been disappearing under administrative costs while she keeps issuing illegal violations. He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing a class action lawsuit. The crowd erupted into cheers. Karen, watching from her window, turned pale. For the first time, the queen of the HOA realized. She was losing. Karen's final, desperate move. Karen Andrews was in full panic mode. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing about Ethan Carter's class action lawsuit. Homeowners were furious, demanding answers from the HOA. Some even refused to pay their outstanding fines, while others began talking to lawyers about getting reimbursed. Karen had spent years ruling over this community like a tyrant. And now, her kingdom was crumbling. But she wasn't going down without a fight. That afternoon, as Ethan sipped his coffee on his porch, 3 police cruisers rolled onto his street. He set down his mug, already knowing exactly who was behind this. Sure enough, Karen emerged from her house, putting on her best fake victim act as she greeted the officers. "Thank goodness you're here," she cried, pointing at Ethan's house. "He's a threat to this community. He's harassing me and endangering our neighborhood." Ethan rolled his eyes. Classic Karen. One of the officers approached him. "Sir, we received a complaint about trespassing and threats of violence." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "From Karen?" The officer hesitated. "We can't disclose the complainant." Ethan smirked. "Right." Karen smiled triumphantly. "He's been stalking me, showing up uninvited, and trying to intimidate me. I have the right to feel safe in my own neighborhood." The officer turned to Ethan. "Sir, do you have any response to these accusations?" Ethan pulled out his phone. With a single tap, he played back a security camera recording, one that showed Karen sneaking onto his property at 2 a.m. the night before. In the footage, she could be seen tampering with his fence, trying to knock off a loose panel. The officers watched in stunned silence. Ethan folded his arms. "You want to talk about trespassing? Because that's her on my property." Karen's face turned ghost white. That's taken out of context," she sputtered. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have an explanation for why you were on Mr. Carter's property?" Karen looked around desperately, but the neighbors had gathered, recording everything on their phones. Ethan smiled. Checkmate. Karen crosses the line and pays the price. Realizing she was cornered, Karen did something no one expected. She lunged forward and ripped Ethan's phone from his hand, hurling it onto the pavement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ethan didn't even flinch. He just looked at the shattered screen, then back at Karen. The officer sighed. "Ma'am, that's destruction of private property." Karen's face froze. "Well, what?" "No. Turn around," the officer said, pulling out his cuffs. Karen's voice rose to a shriek. "No, you can't do this. I'm the HOA president." "That's nice, ma'am. You still broke the law." Click. Click. Karen was officially in handcuffs. The crowd cheered. As they led her toward the police car, she screamed at Ethan, her face red with rage. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Ethan picked up what was left of his phone and smirked. "It is for you." The door slammed shut. The sirens wailed. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. With Karen hauled off in handcuffs, the neighborhood was electric with excitement. Ethan Carter stood on his porch, watching as the last police cruiser pulled away. A mix of cheers and relieved laughter rippled through the crowd. People who had once feared HOA retaliation were now empowered, finally seeing that their so-called leader was nothing more than a bully with a clipboard. But Ethan wasn't done yet, because taking down Karen was just the first step. Now, it was time to bury the entire corrupt HOA. The community revolts. The next morning, Ethan filed a formal complaint with the city, presenting all the evidence he had collected on the HOA's illegal fines and missing funds. Within hours, local news stations picked up the story. By noon, HOA board members were in full panic mode. Stanley, the frail board member who had always seemed uneasy, was the first to crack. He showed up at Ethan's house, looking ashen. "Listen, Carter," he said, rubbing his hands nervously. I had no idea how bad things really were. I swear, I just followed Karen's lead." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying you blindly signed off on her decisions?" Stanley gulped. Yeah." Ethan held up a stack of documents. "Then I hope you're ready to explain that to the city investigators." Stanley paled. Wait. Maybe I can help." Ethan leaned back. "I'm listening." Stanley, desperate to save his own skin, turned over internal HOA emails. Proof that Karen had been pressuring board members to approve bogus violations and funnel fine money into mysterious maintenance fees that never actually went toward the neighborhood. The nail in the coffin? A recorded email chain where Karen bragged about how much money she had made off stupid homeowners who don't read the fine print. Ethan smiled. Gotcha. The final HOA meeting. That evening, the entire neighborhood gathered at the community center for what would be the last HOA meeting under Karen's reign. The remaining board members sat stiffly at the front table, knowing they were doomed. Ethan walked in like a man on a mission, setting down a thick folder of evidence on the podium. "This," he said, his voice calm but firm, "is everything you need to know about how Karen and this HOA have been operating illegally." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan held up a document. "Here's proof that Karen falsified violation reports." Gasps. He held up another. "And here's proof that your fine money never actually went to community improvements." Angry whispers spread through the room. And finally, Ethan clicked a remote, playing an audio recording from Stanley's leaked emails. Karen's voice crackled through the speakers. "These idiots will pay whatever we tell them. It's free money." The crowd erupted. Shouts. Anger. Homeowners demanding justice. One woman stood up, pointing at the board. "We demand this HOA be dissolved." Another man yelled, "We want our money back." The board members looked at each other, panicked. Without Karen, they had no leader, no defense, and no way out. Finally, Stanley stood up, looking defeated. I move to disband the HOA, he mumbled. Seconded. Another board member muttered. And just like that, it was over. The HOA was officially dissolved. Karen loses everything. 2 days later, the city's investigation confirmed what Ethan had exposed. The HOA had illegally collected over $200,000 in bogus fines. Karen had personally embezzled nearly $50,000. Homeowners were entitled to full refunds, with interest. Karen, already facing charges for destruction of property, now had fraud and embezzlement added to her list of legal problems. But her downfall didn't stop there. The bank seized her house when they discovered she had used HOA funds to pay her mortgage. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard. Karen Andrews, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was forced to leave the very neighborhood she once ruled. As Ethan walked past her house one last time, he couldn't help but smirk. Justice had been served. And it was delicious. The HOA faces full legal consequences. With the HOA dismantled and Karen's empire in ruins, the fallout came swift and brutal. The city's legal team wasted no time in pressing charges against the former board members. A class action lawsuit, backed by Ethan's evidence, gained momentum. Homeowners who had been wrongfully fined joined forces, demanding full repayment. And they won. A court ruling ordered that every illegally collected fine be refunded, with an additional penalty slapped on top. That meant homeowners weren't just getting their money back. They were profiting off Karen's corruption. But the biggest blow? The city fined the HOA itself, a staggering $500,000 for fraudulent enforcement. It was a death sentence for what remained of Karen's regime. The HOA's board faces justice. Karen may have been the ringleader, but she wasn't the only guilty one. Ethan had made sure that every board member who helped enforce Karen's illegal policies was held accountable. Linda, Karen's devoted echo chamber, broke down in tears during questioning, claiming she was just following orders. Stanley, who had leaked the emails to save himself, managed to avoid charges, but was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board ever again. 2 other board members, who had signed off on fraudulent violations, were fined heavily and faced community lawsuits from homeowners they had scammed. Within weeks, the once powerful HOA was nothing more than a bad memory. And Ethan Carter? He wasn't done yet. Ethan's final power move. With his legal background, Ethan knew there was one last move to make. He personally ensured that every remaining HOA contract and policy was officially nullified, erasing years of Karen's tyranny. He worked with the city to put protections in place so no future HOA could pull the same tricks. And then, in the ultimate final move, he made sure that Karen could never hold a position of authority again. How? By filing an official complaint with the state HOA regulatory board, ensuring her name was blacklisted from ever running another HOA. Karen Andrews was now powerless. Forever. The neighborhood celebrates. With the lawsuits settled and the HOA gone, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. Freer. At the first post-HOA community gathering, Ethan was treated like a hero. Neighbors shook his hand, thanking him for standing up when no one else could. One older gentleman clapped him on the back. "I've lived here for 20 years, son. And I ain't never seen justice served like that." Ethan just smiled, because for the first time since moving in his home, the place he had fought for, finally felt like home. Karen's personal downfall. With the HOA gone and the legal battle won, most people in the neighborhood moved on. But not Karen Andrews. She had been stripped of everything, her power, her influence, her home. And now, she was desperate to cling to whatever dignity she had left. Except there wasn't any. She had become the town's laughingstock. Karen tries to fight back, and fails. Karen tried to appeal her fines. She tried to file complaints against the city. She even tried to blame her former board members for everything. But nobody listened. Her appeals were denied. Her complaints were thrown out. And when she tried to play the victim, the entire town laughed in her face. She was finished. With no other options, Karen was forced to sell her house, the very home she had once ruled over like a queen. The for sale sign went up overnight, and within days she was gone. For good. Poetic justice hits hard. But the best part? Karen had no choice but to move into a new neighborhood. And guess what? It had an HOA. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Reports started trickling in. Karen, once the almighty enforcer, was now just another regular homeowner, facing the same rules she had once abused. Word spread that she had already been fined twice, once for an overgrown lawn and another for violating mailbox regulations. Rumors even swirled that she had tried to run for the new HOA board, but was laughed out of the room. Karma, it seemed, had a wicked sense of humor. And Ethan Carter? He couldn't have been more satisfied. The final encounter. Weeks later, Ethan ran into an old neighbor at a coffee shop. "You'll never believe what I heard," the man chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Do tell." "Karen's working for an HOA now." Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "You're kidding." "Nope. Apparently, she took a job in another town, handling HOA paperwork." The irony was too much. Karen Andrews, the woman who had spent years lording over homeowners, was now nothing more than a paper pusher, forced to take orders from an actual HOA board. Justice had never tasted sweeter. Ethan simply smirked. "I hope she enjoys it." Epilogue and final mic drop. The neighborhood felt different now. Without the HOA breathing down everyone's necks, things became better. People started painting their homes the colors they actually wanted. Mailboxes were no longer scrutinized like military inspections. Kids played outside without fear of getting fined for sidewalk chalk. And Ethan? For the first time since moving in, he could finally relax. A neighborhood reborn. At the next community barbecue, the first one held without HOA interference, someone handed Ethan a small envelope. "Here," they said with a grin. "It's official." Ethan opened it. Inside was a violation notice, completely fake, written in crayon. "Carter, your porch is too awesome." "Fine, 1 beer." Ethan laughed out loud. "Guess I better pay up," he said, tossing a beer to his neighbor. The whole crowd cheered. The nightmare was over. The neighborhood was theirs again. And Karen Andrews? She was nothing but a bad memory. Final mic drop. Later that evening, as Ethan sat on his porch, enjoying the peace and quiet, he got a text message from an unknown number. "Karen Andrews, you think you won? This isn't over." Ethan stared at the screen. Then he simply typed back, "It is for me. Enjoy your new HOA." And with that, he blocked her number and never thought about her again.